Are there any links that you all will want Jenny or I to drop during the presentation into the chat box? Exactly.
There is a moratorium call.
Yep.
Oh, I think I have that link.
I thought you might.
Imagine that. I think I do.
So we're doing a prior on the.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm just going to confirm who else we're expecting as far as presenters. Is it Maxx and Kiara?
Yeah.
And Valerie?
Right.
Is Valerie joining us?
Valerie's not joining. Alex is not joining.
Okay.
As far as I know.
Okay.
And I don't have Maxx in the waiting room nor Kiara.
Okay. Let me hit them up real quick. I want to make sure that we're using Max's current email in the communications because his email changed.
I'm pretty sure we were,
Okay.
but yeah. Okay.
Let me see if I could text them real quick.
This is the link to the Mentimeter thing. Is that like okay to everyone?
That will do it.
And then I can show the word cloud kind of at the end, maybe, of the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, Andy, I wouldn't mind just also getting your advice. We have like the dedication for Marco slide. I was thinking of pausing on that for a minute. I mean, I know there's an amazing dedication just at the beginning. I mean, at the plenary session. What do folks think? What do you think about that?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Can we take a minute at the Marco? There's a slide for Marco, and can we take a minute there? I know there was already a dedication at the plenary session. Is it too repetitive if we take a minute?
No, Marco deserves all the dedication. Thank you. That's perfect.
Oh, by the way, I was nodding in agreement, but maybe not on screen, so thank you. Thanks, Nana.
Still no Maxx or Kiara.
I think Kiara just joined.
Yeah,
Hey,
Kiara's
Kiara.
here.
Welcome.
Kiara.
Hi.
Hey everyone.
Kiara, you're now a co-host.
Looks like we have an awesome turnout, folks.
Yeah.
And we're at 1 minute or so past. I think we're still waiting for Maxx. We can just hold on a little bit longer, do you think? Or
go ahead and start. Okay, I will let everybody in and then turn the meeting over to Kelly and Jenny. If anything, just hit me up in the chat. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first breakout of HINAC regarding molecular surveillance. I'm Kevin Lish with the CERO project, and I'm going to turn it over to today's moderators, Kelly Flannery and Jenny Cameo-Smith from Positive Women's Network. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kelly Flannery, she, her, hers. And hi, everyone. Sorry, I think I was speaking while on mute. I'm Kelly Flannery, she, her, hers with Positive Women's Network. And Jenny, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Jenny Smith Camejo, she, her, also Positive Women's Network.
Excellent. So welcome, everyone. I just want to give you an update that there actually is interpretation available for this presentation. If you look at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side, you'll see a little globe, and underneath it, it says interpretation. If you click that, you can choose English or Spanish. So if you're a Spanish speaker, you can go ahead and choose Spanish and then just follow the prompts from there. And with that, I think would turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Jenny. My name is Martin French. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to this discussion. I'm calling in from Montreal in Canada, and I'm co-chairing today's session with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Andrew Spieldenner. I want to just open today with a few acknowledgements, and then I'm going to turn the mic over to Andy, and we're going to get into I think what's going to be a really interesting discussion with our amazing panelists on HIV surveillance and what it is and what it means. So I want to just begin first by thanking and acknowledging a colleague, Valerie Nicholson, who came up with, helped come up with the title of today's session, Centering Lived and Living Experiences of HIV Surveillance. Valerie says that it's important not only to focus on lived experiences, kind of past experience, but living experiences as well, the experiences that people are having in their everyday lives. We can't lose sight of the ongoing reality that we're in. I want to begin also with a land acknowledgement. As I mentioned, I'm calling in from Montreal, otherwise known as Tiohtià:ke. The Kanien'kehá:ka nation is the traditional custodians of the land and waters in the area that I'm calling in from. And since I've been living here, I've been working really hard to decolonize my mind and learn more about this history. And I think that's vital as someone who is in a settler state, who is a white male citizen of that settler state. There's a lot of work to do, so much work to do really to decolonize our minds. And I've been reading a lot, and if anyone wants to talk about that after the session, I'm happy to share titles with you, including Audra Simpson's amazing book, Mohawk Interruptus, and so many other books. So why is it important to start, not just to start with a land acknowledgement? I feel like we skip over acknowledgements so quickly sometimes. And one other place where acknowledgements often get skipped over is in HIV surveillance reports. If you actually look at HIV surveillance reports, and I'll show you one in a few minutes, we'll show you one in a few minutes. You know, there are people who are kind of acknowledged in the technical notes, public health professionals, you know, public health officials, and epidemiologists who do the work. It's very important work. They deserve to be acknowledged for that work. But there's a massive absence as well. People living with HIV don't merit mention for their contribution, their real embodied contribution to HIV surveillance. They often go unmentioned. And I think that today's session is really about trying to change that and challenge that. I want to just share my screen.
Martin, while you're sharing your screen, there is a request for you to speak up a little bit, if possible.
Thank you. Sorry, folks. Is that better? Can you hear me better now?
I think so, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, folks. All right, can everybody see the slides okay?
Yes.
Thank you. So as I mentioned,
Actually, Martin, we're seeing the presenter view, the speaker view. If you want to show the full slide deck, I think we need to change that.
Sorry, let's try that. Sorry, folks, just bear with me 1 second.
Maybe while we're getting the slides set up, could we ask our participants to just introduce themselves in the chat box, let us know who's here, and if there's anything particularly that you wanted to get out of this session. So name, pronoun, if you're affiliated with an organization, and anything in particular you wanted to get out of today's session. We're so glad to have you all here.
Is that okay, folks? Can you see the slides now, not in presenter view?
Perfect.
Apologies for that. Okay, so thank you, and thank you, Naina, for the help there. I wanted to just begin by holding a minute of space for Marco, our beloved colleague and friends. Marco was meant to be on today's panel, and in today's discussion, we had a beautiful memorial for him at the plenary opening. And I want to just also hold a minute of silence for Marco right now. Rest in power, Marco. We're going to jump in now with a kind of opening presentation. And Andy, I think we're going to share the work of presenting the session. We want to really focus on a few things in this discussion, namely, what HIV surveillance is from the perspective of if we centered people living with HIV, people affected by HIV in the discussion. As you can see from this slide, surveillance often is a way of classifying people according to identities, identifications, let's say, and categories that they might not use themselves to describe themselves, right? If you can see these different ways of classifying people. And so we can think of surveillance as reducing the complexities of people's lives down to categories and connections. And I've been thinking, I think I started without even really, I started with the acknowledgements, but not really with much of an introduction to myself. I've been thinking about surveillance for a long time. I'm an associate professor of sociology with the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University in Montreal. I'm a member of the Canadian Coalition to Reform HIV Criminalization. I've been coming to HINAC for a number of years now, and it is amazing to have the chance to speak at HINAC with such a fantastic group of panelists. I use the he, him pronouns. We want to talk a little bit about different kinds of surveillance. So Andy, I think what I'll do, Andy, is just kind of, if it's okay with you, I'll say a few words about, how public health usually describes surveillance, and then, oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to talk about any logistics for the session? Sorry about that. And then I can jump back to this slide here.
Sure, Martin. So we've gotten another request, Martin, if you could speak up when you're speaking. Just letting you know. So, hi, I'm Andy Spieldenner. I know many of the people here. So, and for those that don't, I'm happy to get to know you virtually. I am the vice chair of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, as well as the executive director of MPACT, Global Action for Gay Health and Rights. And I am calling in from Guadalajara, Mexico, where I've been living during COVID. And I'm glad to be here today. This is an informational session, as well as kind of to get people to really think through what's going on in HIV surveillance today. The title of this session is called the Centering Lived and Living Experiences of HIV Surveillance. As somebody living with HIV, I know that one of the things that has always kind of bothered me when I see these large data packs around, the seroprevalence and of HIV cases, and those kinds of large data sets, I always get confused because I realize I'm in that data set. My own body is actually part of that data set. And I always feel like when public health approaches us as kind of numbers and statistics, they kind of leave out the context of our lives. And so this session is really about a conversation primarily amongst people living with HIV, as well as our allies, to talk about the wider context of our lives and how different parts of us get affected by increased surveillance, even in HIV surveillance. So we have three goals. One is to provide space for participants to connect personal experience to HIV surveillance. The next one is to increase participants' understanding of what's called molecular HIV surveillance, which is the new kind of surveillance that's occurring right now across the country. And the third goal is to build momentum around our call for a moratorium on this practice of molecular HIV surveillance. Why have we brought this conversation here? One of the things around, thank you all for coming to HINAC. HIV is not a crime. one of the things that's happened in the time that I've been working on HIV criminalization in the US is that my understanding of what constitutes criminalization is actually not just an HIV law, an HIV specific law, but a wider set of practices that target people living with HIV in more than they do other people. And so one of the things that we hope to do here is to really bring in that conversation on HIV surveillance with issues around criminalization. At a very blunt level, surveillance is used in criminalization cases. Public health officials are asked to testify. And so that is one very, very straightforward way, but there are other ways that surveillance can be used to promote different kinds of discriminatory and stigmatizing ways of thinking. And we're here today to kind of go through with this amazing roster of people, go through different aspects of what surveillance and molecular HIV surveillance in particular can do. This was originally planned to be an in-person interactive session. Obviously that didn't happen. Want to still maintain some level of interactivity. So Martin will put in a way to a little app called Mentimeter. And we want to ask you, what does HIV surveillance mean to you? And then we're going to create a word cloud so we can see. Martin, can you put that in? Okay, it's in the chat now. If you could click on it. And what does HIV surveillance mean to you? Go ahead and put it in the Mentimeter. And then we'll all get a sense of what this crowd is thinking about HIV surveillance. Okay.
I think folks can see the word cloud taking shape. And if you want to keep, helping us to redefine HIV surveillance by putting terms in here that help us to think about this throughout the session as our amazing panelists are speaking and reflecting with us on these issues, please keep plugging these words in. I think this is vital, important work. Sorry, and thank you everybody who told me that I'm not projecting. I'm going to try and project more so that you can hear me better. Yes, this is fantastic. We'll come back to this slide as the session goes on and at the end of the session. So please keep helping us to define and redefine HIV surveillance. Andy, do you want to talk a little bit about the format?
Sure. So we're going to have different people talk about different aspects of surveillance and different things that come into our lives. One of the different issues around surveillance that come into our lives. So for instance, and we're going to talk about molecular HIV surveillance and how it affects our communities separately. In the end, we'll ask for people to sign on to a more or review and promote a moratorium that the Caucus, PWN, and several other networks are pushing. Other things about the format?
I think that's great, Andy. Maybe I can just mention that Alex McClelland, who was meant to join us as a speaker today, was unable to join us, and so Alex was going to be giving us a rundown on HIV surveillance and MHS, kind of a brief intro. And I think Andy, you and I are just going to share that. Is that okay?
Sure.
I'm going to just flip back to the slides again. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. And it's not the presenter view this time, apologies. So I really wanted to just make 2 points here with 2 slides very briefly. When public health experts describe or define HIV surveillance, I think that they typically have a rather narrow understanding, in mind. And it's this kind of report produced by the CDC, produced by the Public Health Agency of Canada. We have similar reports here in Canada that describe surveillance as tracking a number of cases in a population. And in this way, public health sort of decenters the idea that HIV surveillance might be about tracking individuals. And that's something that I think we want to problematize. We want to challenge and trouble in this session. And when public health experts describe HIV surveillance in this way, they're thinking of epidemiological surveillance, and they're thinking of states receiving case reports, and that when these reports filter up to the national level, they're de-identified, meaning that the personally identifiable information has been removed from these case reports, and it's just about counting numbers. And so that's often what public health officials, or people who work in public health, mean when they say HIV surveillance. I don't want to say that's the only way that people who work in public health are thinking about this. There are many people who work in public health who think maybe differently about these kinds of things. But I think this is the dominant way that public health tends to talk about HIV surveillance. But what does HIV surveillance look like when we center people and communities affected by HIV? When we put at the center of their picture their lived and living experience, their embodied experiences. Well, it's case reports, as that previous slide mentioned, but it might also be things like visits from a disease intervention specialist doing contact tracing or partner notification. It might be clinical surveillance, forms of surveillance that people experience when they seek clinical care. Think about viral load testing, for example, and drug resistance testing, very important surveillance for the management, for the work of clinical care. It absolutely, in a lot of cases, can have a positive benefit. But drug resistance testing in particular is something we're going to talk a little bit more about because it's at the root of molecular HIV surveillance. It's really the repurposing, I would say, or the transformation of the data collected for drug resistance testing, as Andy will talk about in a second, that gives us molecular HIV surveillance. We might also think about lateral surveillance, the idea that people have their serostatus outed, for example, on a social network. Different forms of gaze, or in that amazing poem that we saw in the plenary session, in the art submission, talking about like experiencing a glare, right? The glare of people. So what we wanted to just emphasize is that actually when we center, with this slide, when we center people and communities affected by HIV in the discussion of HIV surveillance, we get a much broader picture and lots of different forms of surveillance that intersect, that come together in a kind of assemblage. As Naina mentioned in the plenary session, maybe we'll talk about more in the panel discussion, this is a big system that is engaged in various forms of social control and intersects with other forms of oppression in people's everyday lives. And sometimes I wonder whether that public health definition, which is pretty narrow, totally misses all of this. Well, let's jump to another slide on molecular HIV surveillance now to introduce that. And Andy, do you want to pick it up from here?
Sure, Martin. So molecular HIV surveillance or cluster and outbreak detection and response is a way of doing surveillance where, as a person living with HIV, our blood is, anytime our treatment regimen changes or begins, our doctor takes our blood for resistance testing. That resistance testing is sent to a lab. Well, the CDC repurposes the blood sample and the data set to go into a different data set where it's anonymized and then compared to other phylogenetic sequences of HIV in our region. And so what this does is it gives the CDC and public health the capacity to see if multiple strains of the same HIV virus are being is being distributed in a region. And so what happens is if a certain number of what's called clusters are identified, a certain number of cases are identified, it's called a cluster. And when clusters are identified, basically there's a certain number of cases in a certain amount of time, and CDC informs the public health department to do an investigation. The public health department de-anonymizes the data so they can contact the person, identify the person, and the intent of it is to get people into care and to reallocate resources faster for kind of real-time interventions by the public health system. And one of the challenges of molecular HIV surveillance is that it relies on people who are not virally suppressed, right? It's targeting people who are not virally suppressed. And we know from the work that we do in our communities as well as in our own lives that those least likely to be virally suppressed are those people who are poor, those people who are migrants, those people who are people of trans experience, people of color, all the ways in which we can be excluded from clinical care and discriminated against, people who are sex workers. And so one of the things that we hope to get out of this discussion, so this is happening right now. And so for every person living with HIV that's attending right now, all of our data is kept in this database. That to me is kind of shocking. You know, it is, we would like to kind of broaden the discussion today with our panelists to be able to talk through what does it mean to be targeted? What does it mean to be a person of color, to be a person living with HIV who's trans, who's a sex worker, who's a person who uses drugs, and to have enhanced public health investigation in our lives. So, you know, that's something that we want to be able to talk about today. So with that, I think we should transition to be able to the panel for the discussion. Right?
Yes, thanks, Andy. Yeah, so let's we've got an amazing, as I said, roster of panelists. Let's turn it over to our panelists. And I don't know, we can ask some questions, but I know our panelists also have lots of things to say on this. I don't know if someone would like to volunteer to go first. Or maybe I can call on Kiara. I know when we were planning this session, you had some amazing points to make about education. I don't know if you want to kind of reflect on education and lack of community engagement around MHS, for example.
Yes, thank you, Mark. So yeah, I also put in the chat box, one of the things that it doesn't capture is how systemic racism and poverty are leading risk factors for communities, high-risk communities contracting HIV. And so I think that's one of the main issues I have with you know, this type of surveillance, is that it is very much like I feel as an African American, I'm a Black woman of trans experience for those folks who don't know, you know, but my first identity is African American, I'm African. And I often, I was watching When They See Us the other day, with some friends because I didn't want to watch it by myself. But one of the things that always has come to mind for me is whenever white folks in academia think about or claim they see Black people, it is through the lens of otherness. It is through the lens of pathologizing us. It is through the lens of criminalizing us. And then it's through the lens of how to contain us. And so I feel that there's nothing really has changed from, you know, the 1619 project to present, and how the Black community, the African community, and all of our diversity, we are really seen as like a targeted population, you know, to either push new medications on. So I also put in the chat, like, you know, the surveillance also leads to, it's a way for them to project profits and what communities that are going to be seeing a jump or increase in transmission rate. And so it has never sat well with me, because I know that when they see us, they don't see our humanity. And that's one of the main issues I have with this type of surveillance. It is a westernized way of continuing to colonize us and compartmentalize us into these stigmatizing categories that has never existed anywhere in the world until we got colonized. And so it doesn't sit well with me. I understand that also, as Andrew was saying, like they're using our data, you know, they're using our blood type, and they're making money off of it, right? And none of that sits well. And so I feel like one of the main things we have to do is really make sure that we are engaging with our community, let them know how we have a right to give consent. And the way that it is set up now, we're not given that agency to give consent in how our data is going to be used and set up. And so definitely I find that this is an area of concern for me. And so, yeah, I don't know if I covered everything you wanted to cover, Mark.
Yeah, that's amazing, Kiara. Thank you so much for that. We also could think a little bit. One of the things that you know, you were highlighting for me is this like lack of understanding that on the part of quite powerful actors who are engaged in things like molecular HIV surveillance about what different community concerns might be. And I wonder if Andy, Naina, and Kiara, you all have experiences trying to raise critical questions with researchers and with public health about this. I don't know if you want to have a reflection on that. I know this was a point that Marco really wanted to stress as well in the planning for this session. So I wonder if anyone wants to jump in with a reflection on that.
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that. Thank you so much, Martin and Andy, and thank you, Kiara, for your powerful framing. So I'm Naina, she or they pronouns with Positive Women's Network. I would like to just kind of like summarize some of the concerns that we've heard from the community of people living with HIV about molecular HIV surveillance. And so, you know, one concern that I think has been lifted up, but that I just really emphasize is that people living with HIV never consented to have our data taken and used in this type of way. Most of us didn't even know it was happening. And so, you know, to realize that in some states like Washington State, they're very far along actually with having like 70%, 80% of the genomic sequences from people living with HIV in these databases in certain counties. It's quite alarming, right? And the public health departments are really proud of that. But when people living with HIV, when we realize this is happening, it's a very like visceral reaction to say, you know, wait, what? My data is in this database and is being compared to other people's data, and I didn't even know, right? It kind of, it breaks a level of trust sometimes also with our providers who are actually compelled by law to share the data in this way. So we work, our HIV providers have worked really hard to overcome, you know, a legacy of justifiable mistrust from communities most impacted by the HIV epidemic, and encourage us to be in care and encourage us that it's like safe to be in care, you know, that our confidentiality and privacy will not be broken. And so this is quite a big violation of that sort of like unspoken contract that we have with our healthcare providers. And it puts them into a very difficult situation as well, because they don't have the choice. They're required by federal law to report this data, and then the data is out of their control. And the data is not only being shared with the de-identified data is not only being shared with CDC and compared across state lines, which is, you know, in itself quite alarming. This data actually goes to publicly available databases as well. It is de-identified data. It does not have any personal information. That's what that means. But it is in publicly available databases like the Los Alamos Research Lab database, where researchers can like pull these genomic sequences out of the database and use them to run, you know, molecular projects and kind of like look at what's happening and identify trends. And so, you know, they get very excited about this, being able to look at and identify trends that actually often could be understood and identified if they would just talk to people living with HIV, right? Like traditional disease intervention services, contact tracing, and things like that. So, you know, so one big issue is this issue of consent. And in fact, in one study that was conducted in Philadelphia, over half of people living with HIV did not want their data taken or used in this way. So this is not just some abstract thing that like a few people are concerned about. This is a very widely felt concern and issue. I also want to uplift that there are no consistent protections for the ways that this data is used and shared at the state level. So NASTAD, the National Association of State and Territorial AIDS Directors, actually did a study and they released the results in 2018. They looked at the health data privacy and data sharing environment in 10 different states in the US to kind of compare what the standards were. And by standards, I mean, are they, you know, do health departments, what protections do they have for like sharing this type of data with law enforcement or immigration enforcement or other types of places? If they're asked for this data, if they're asked to, you know, produce information about an individual that is identified as part of a cluster, what protections does the health department itself have to be able to say, we're not providing you with that information in a criminal investigation or something like that? Well, there's a lot of variation in what states are allowed to do. And so the safeguards are not adequate in place for us to feel comfortable that, you know, molecular HIV surveillance is not just some abstract practice. It is the fourth pillar of the End the HIV Epidemic response. It is being used in every state. It is being used in every territory. Any state or territory that gets CDC funding to do HIV work is doing molecular HIV surveillance. This is happening in your community already. So it is not unreasonable for people living with HIV to say, you need to show us that our data is safe, that it is secure, that it cannot be used in police, in prosecutions, that it cannot be used in immigration proceedings and things like that. So those are, you know, those are a couple of categories. There's a big kind of question out there about how molecular HIV surveillance relates to HIV criminalization. And in fact, genomic sequence data has been used in criminal prosecutions successfully, but it has not really, we haven't seen a big uptick in that yet in the US, but that doesn't mean it could not happen. And why would we wait for somebody to be criminalized and successfully prosecuted because of this data in order to stop it? So I think I'll stop there, but those are a few concerns that have been expressed by community members.
And I think I want to appreciate Liz in the chat box, who's a participant, talking about her own concern of being part of the system that was part of partner notification and disease intervention surveillance. One of the challenges that I see in the US is the inconsistency in practices and policies around disease intervention surveillance. And so, you know, different jurisdictions have different rules about how people show up at your jobs and your homes and ask you about who you slept with, who your drug using partners are. And I think that that's another way in which health departments can do real harm in our lives. You know, I've been part of a couple public health investigations on syphilis, and in both cases, the person, because I wouldn't give any names, said, well, I'm going to call the police and then you can talk to them. And I was like, okay. But, you know, I was worried that they would, and one of them showed up at my job. So, you know, I think that we also need to look at potential harms that can happen with people that are already stigmatized. As Kiara pointed out, most of the people that would be found in a cluster detection investigation are already marginalized through systemic racism and poverty, as well as other kinds of stigmatizing experiences. So, you know, I think that that's one of the reasons why we're asking for this moratorium and for people to sign on.
And one more thing I want to add is that, you know, again, these concerns are not abstract. So information about cluster tracing investigations, or whatever they want to call it, you know, when public health departments are tracking what they call a cluster, meaning linked HIV transmissions or acquisitions, viruses that are very closely related to each other that happen within a short amount of time, the health department identifies that this is happening, and then they respond. When they respond, that's a big deal. And sometimes the media learns about it. And in fact, sometimes they want the media to learn about it, because sometimes it has to do with other programs that they're trying to put in place. These are, you know, these are things that, of course, I think we all share, you know, the goal of making sure that people living with HIV are linked to care effectively, are found, are able to access services and things like that. But what happens is sometimes those this process is very risky. So, for example, in Seattle, when the Seattle Health Department was responding to what they called a cluster that they were following, the newspaper actually printed an article about it and named the street it was happening on. And this was an investigation that was ongoing primarily amongst people who were unhoused and people who were using drugs. And so, you know, the newspaper article literally says, like, HIV outbreak on this street in North Seattle is being traced by the, you know, by the health department. Well, how much vulnerability and danger does that create for folks who are living on the streets, on that street, you know, or people who are like getting high on that street or whatever, you know, like that is literally putting people in potential harm's way. We all know that people have been killed for disclosing their HIV status. People have been harmed for disclosing their HIV status. So there are lots of different forms of violence that this opens us up to.
Maybe I can jump in and ask a question of everybody. And it has to do, in some ways, I think I'm trying to join two amazing points that I heard in the plenary. One from you, Naina, about the politics of criminalization. And we could think about stigma and discrimination and criminalization as being on a spectrum. And to the extent that surveillance amplifies stigmatization, it primes people's thinking for criminalization. So there's a real politics to the processes of data collection that you're describing. And Kiara, you mentioned in your opening words about the importance of actually being able to count in some senses, having, I guess, control and self-determination over the politics of those numbers to be able to access resources. So I guess I would like to hear folks reflect on, the politics of surveillance here, or counting maybe, and think about or reflect on how are you feeling like you're at the center of the discussion, or I kind of get the sense from reading HIV surveillance reports and talking to public health authorities that there's not a lot of support for fostering the leadership and self-determination of communities living affected by HIV to control the processes of surveillance that are going on here.
Yeah, definitely. This is one of the things that Marco's always highlighted, the importance of MIPA, meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, AIDS. And that is really important, that we start to center the community that is being surveyed against our will, and also understand that there's a connection, like America loves to penalize people, period. Right? Doesn't matter if America is, that's one of the reasons why America, we're like 4% of the world population, but yet we have 25% of all incarcerated individuals on this earth globally. It's America, and it speaks to a connection to school to prison pipeline, having free labor to continue to make Jeff Bezos like a multi-trillionaire, and so I'm always thinking about how do we make sure that we are really shifting how our data is being used, but most importantly, how we are centering the HIV community. And so I know, I don't know, folks may have heard of Frantz Fanon. He was an Afro-French academic, and he spoke a lot about, I'm trying to get it right, the colonized intellectual, right? And so part of the problem is that we have too many Black and brown folks who are academic, but they are just replicating what they're told is, oh, this is how it's going to be. And so we need for them to understand that they have an obligation to also stand with us to make sure that Black and brown voices are centered, and that we move away from this westernized way of collecting data that is used without our consent. It's used, and I'm always concerned, how not just about how they're profiting from it, but how they're using our data and our samples, our blood samples, to create more harm in the future when it comes to, I'm paranoid. So I think we all probably have seen Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes, right? So that weighs heavy on my mind. I'm like, well, where's this data going? And what is the end goal for collecting this data, right? And so I am someone who is very aware of there are too many unanswered questions in how and why our data is being used. And so I definitely feel that we need for our BPOC academics to stop replicating these problematic systems and give pushback on why this way of collecting data is doing more harm than good.
Thank you, Kiara. That's amazing. And one of the real ways in which we can see that health departments don't know our communities very well is the way they talk about us, and kinds of the ways that they even claim to know us, when one of the central groups that gets identified in many of these investigations or analyses are women of trans experience. And these health departments are like, well, how can we even find trans people, you know, that what are their names? And I know in one health department, they were going to ask, they were surprised because they discovered that trans women were part of heterosexual clusters, not gay clusters. And they did not realize that trans women had sex with straight men. So that would surprise them. And then their solution was to ask the straight men who had been identified to give them a list of all their trans sexual partners. And when they said that, I just said, you're just going to get a bunch of women killed. Like, this is insane. Like, that's not a humane way. Like, that's, you have to conceptualize of the violence that's already available in our lives that we're vulnerable to. And the ways in which women, trans and cis women are vulnerable to violence are very different than from other groups. And so I was just shocked that that was what they were going to do. And I think that this is not, as Nana said, this is not hypothetical. These are things happening in real time. They're happening today. They're continuing to happen. And that's why we're asking for this and asking for the space at HINAC to have this discussion.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add a couple things. You know, I think part of the whole challenge is that in the entire construction of the domestic response to HIV, if you look at the End the Epidemic plan, if you read the HIV National Strategic Plan, people living with HIV are the problem. We are the problem. That's how we're constructed in these policy documents, right? As problems to be managed and controlled and tracked and traced. And that is what molecular HIV surveillance is. You know, as recently as 2017, a sitting US House of Representatives person, Betty Price in Georgia, proposed quarantining people living with HIV. Well, guess who Betty Price's husband was? It was Tom Price, who was the US Secretary of Health and Human Services. So these are not, you know, these are not actually, again, like hypothetical or abstract concerns. Just because we have a new administration doesn't mean that people living with HIV are not at risk in multiple ways, and that the communities we come from are already hyper-policed, over-policed, over-criminalized, right? And so we know that this just generates vulnerability in so many different ways. So I do want to just briefly talk about what folks can do before we land. So one thing is, if you are involved in anything around your End the Epidemic jurisdictional planning process, you can be raising questions about what is going on with molecular HIV surveillance in your jurisdiction. We are also demanding that, you know, not every state has decriminalized HIV, of course. It's going to be a process. It's a long-term process. But any jurisdiction that is looking for this End the Epidemic funding should be demonstrating a commitment to create a favorable human rights environment for people living with HIV, an environment where it is safe to be in healthcare. Right? Like, that's the basic. That we shouldn't even really have to say that, but that needs to be written into the plan. So you can be looking at those plans, demanding that there's some accountability around decriminalization, around creating a favorable human rights environment, decriminalization of HIV, decriminalization of sex work, et cetera. Resisting anti-trans legislation. Like, these are all components of an End the Epidemic response that must be in place. Of course, please sign our moratorium statement to demonstrate that you are concerned about this. And we need you to join with us in uplifting this concern and making sure that our, you know, rights can get stripped away very, very, very quickly. And it is a cascading process, and it's really hard to get them back if you ever can. And so we need this to stop right now while we work at the state level to get safeguards in place in every state and every territory that is being funded for HIV prevention and healthcare efforts.
Thank you, the three of you. And one thing that I just want to, we're coming sort of close to time, so I just want to mention is that Maxx Boykin was also meant to be a panelist in today's discussion, and has really helped shape my thinking on issues related to MHS through some discussions that we've had. And also, you know, the moratorium kind of connects with this broader question, right? About who is this helping? Is it necessary? Could you imagine a world in which all the money being spent on MHS was just transferred, for example, to community-based organizations that could keep track of these issues, right? Like, I think that there's an economic justice kind of set of questions as well here that you know, all of our panelists have kind of underscored in a lot of ways. So I don't know, I just wanted to mention that as well. Maxx, I don't think could join us today, but you know, is very much informed my thinking on this and in the discussion. So I don't know if folks want to have a last word, you know, before we wrap up. Nana, do you want to say anything, for example, about the moratorium? Last word on that?
Sign it and spread the word. Thank you. I do want to acknowledge that there are a lot of folks on here who are participants in this session who have been involved in working on molecular HIV surveillance concerns in significant ways. And thank you for being here. Thank you for your work. We need to organize a broad national movement on this. So if you're interested in being more involved, anyone, please get in touch with us. I'm dropping my email in the chat box right now.
I just popped our word cloud into the screen. I hope you can see it. Criminalization actually features very strongly in the center. So thank you for participating in that. And I think maybe Andy, I don't know if last words go to you or our moderators, I'm not sure, but I just want to thank everybody for this session and sharing your brilliance.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for participating. Thank you, Kiara and Nana and Martin. And thank you all. We have our next steps. Kiara, did you want to close us out?
Thank you, Andrew. I think my main concern at this current juncture of our existence is we must put pressure on Biden and Harris to stand with us, because we have such a short window of opportunity. We have the ear of the White House right now, and we need to make sure that we are bombarding them with you know, our concerns around surveillance and how it's collected, because I don't think there's going to be a second term. So we have to do our part now. Barack Obama said when he was in office, if you want to make me do something, if you want me to do something, then make me. And so we have an obligation to really amplify our voices, amplify our concerns, and make sure that in the short time of opportunity that we have, that we're able to really start shifting how folks are looking at collecting our data.
And I think you can close us out. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And, keep Marco in your hearts, too.
Yes.
We miss him.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.